Welcome back. A long time ago in a land far away, I studied earthquakes. Um, and I promised a couple days ago I'd talk about them a little bit. I'm going to give an example I'm going to use earthquakes to illustrate scaling, and hopefully I can build a metaphor out of that for some of the challenges we face with respect to medical care and COVID-19. Right, so let's get started. I studied earthquakes in California, roughly. So that's California. The fault I studied was the San Andreas, but schematically it's a fault that goes like this. And the Pacific plate is going that way. Actually, I want this little arrow down here. And the North American plate is going that way, and they're sliding past each other. So you can think of, most of the time, this fault is just stuck. So if you, at some time, drew a line across it, as time went on and the Pacific plate went that way, the stick would start to be shaped like that. And eventually, the fault would not be strong enough, or the stick wouldn't be strong enough, and it would break. And you would have something like this, and that breaking is an earthquake. So let's draw a little systems model of earthquakes. So I started off talking about that stress accumulates along this crack in the earth, the surface of the earth. So stress on fault is a stock, how much stress is on that break at any given time. And that stock goes up as the plates move past each other, and it goes up relative to plate velocity, which is slow compared to walking and all that sort of thing. But it's enough so that things add up. And then at some point we have an earthquake and stress is relieved. Relief. That comes from somewhere, and that essentially becomes heat and damage. Now, what determines when this happens is the strength of the fault. And I'm just going to have a model here for the strength of the fault. Fault strength. So when the stress on the fault exceeds the strength of the fault, then we have an earthquake. But not all earthquakes are the same size. So when the strength, is exceeded, an earthquake happens, but we don't know how big that earthquake's going to be. But we do know that we do often know about the size, distribution, of earthquakes. So that becomes a parameter that determines how much stress is relieved. And then, of course, the fault strength, there's a whole model here, but it depends on the earthquake history in the region, where we are, that is, what kinds of rocks and stuff like that. And then the shape of the fault. So So that's a model for earthquakes. And it turns out that this size distribution is an interesting thing, and that's where we're going. So there is a systems model of earthquakes. The important things are the stress on the earthquake, the stress on the fault, the ability of the fault to hold on to that stress, and then what happens when that stress, the details of how that stress is relieved. So we've got that. All right, so I only have one whiteboard and it's not very big, so I'm sure you've all copied this down, haha. So let's dive into this a little bit. So my advisor, my PhD advisor, is a very important scientist who studied earthquakes. He literally wrote the book on, it's called, I think it's called The Dynamics of Earthquakes and Faulting. I got a figure in the second edition. So we have this, we still have this going on, but now let's look at the fault from this side. So turns out that the way the Earth is organized, there's air here, and then there's a strong layer called the crust, and then there's a weak layer called the asthenosphere, but that's okay. When there's an earthquake, let's say an earthquake happens here, stress is relieved over some area like that. Or, whoops, in that same place, stress might be relieved, more stress might be relieved, like this, because this weak layer can't support stress. So, there are, in earthquake world, there are lots and lots of earthquakes like this, small ones that never hit the edge of the strong layer. And if we, the way that earthquake scientists think about this is, I'll say we make histograms on their side. So we say that, and we use logarithms. So this is size, and this is how many. And and you can think of this as a histogram on its side. I think I already said that. So there's lots. So small earthquakes are here. Lots of them are over here. So there's lots and lots of little earthquakes. Not quite so many. The next size, not quite so many. The next size. And it turns out it's in this kind of plot, it's a line. Well, Schultz and his graduate students, not me actually, I studied other things, but I think it was Javier Pacheco wrote this paper. So for earthquakes that are small, these are small earthquakes, and these are large earthquakes. So I showed over there that, so log n, how many? Histogram on its side, how big? And we see that the small ones do like this. Well, the large ones also are a line in this kind of a plot, but they have a different slope. Like that. So there's a break between large earthquakes and small earthquakes, and it has to do with how thick the crust is. That is, this point here occurs when an earthquake goes from being small to being large. So in some sense it's right here, or you can, in this diagram, kind of right there. And it has to do with this thickness. Now, so one way to think about this is that when enough stress or things that contribute to the size of the earthquake has been accumulated, the earthquake is big enough that it saturates. It uses up the ability of this layer to contain it. So when we have a small earthquake, all the energy can be contained in an equal way in this layer. When there's more stress or a bigger earthquake, bigger stress release, then the energy that's being released, the stress that's being released, and I'm sorry to my physicist friends, can't be contained equally in this layer and starts to spread out this way. So the idea is that the energy saturates the ability of the strong layer to contain it. All right, and it's that idea of saturation that we're worrying about with respect to COVID-19 and our ability to care for people with that disease. All right, so that is the short aside on earthquakes and the difference between small earthquakes and large earthquakes. All right. Next we'll look at try to make an analogy with COVID.